"Get away from my car, you filthy piece of trash." The man's voice rang out like a whip across the sidewalk, sharp and coated with disgust. Without warning, the paper cup clutched in the homeless man's trembling hands was slapped away, coffee spilling across his threadbare jacket, staining the concrete like a spreading bruise. The man didn't stop there. He shoved him backward, and the older man stumbled, falling hard against the curb. His elbows scraped the pavement, but he made no sound, no anger, no pleading, just silence. A young woman walking by flinched but kept going. A couple nearby glanced over, then looked away. People like you don't belong in this part of the city. He didn't know, he didn't even imagine, that the man he'd just humiliated in broad daylight was actually Darius Templeton, the founder and CEO of Unity Market, the largest privately owned organic food chain in the country. 2 days earlier, Darius had stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, the Seattle skyline unfolding beneath him like a polished painting. From here, the world looked orderly, structured, clean. His leather desk chair hadn't even cooled from his last meeting with the expansion board, and yet his mind was elsewhere, outside, down below, at the edge of a bus shelter on 3rd Avenue. A man with matted hair and a half-zip jacket sat motionless, a cardboard sign resting on his knees. "Anything helps," it read. Darius watched as people walked by. Some slowed, most didn't. One man dropped a coin without looking. Another moved several feet to the side, as if a 6-foot arc of shame surrounded the man. It wasn't new. Darius had seen scenes like this all his life, but lately they stirred something deeper. Maybe it was because of that letter, the one from a young employee in Tacoma who'd written about being formerly homeless and how Unity's community fridge saved her family one winter. Or maybe it was the visit to the new outreach center, where a man his own age had looked at him and said, "You don't really see us. You see a problem to be fixed." Darius hadn't replied then, but he'd felt it. Later that evening, at his family's home nestled in Northgate Hills, Darius sat with his father, Howard Templeton, the man who had started Unity out of a van and a passion for feeding underserved neighborhoods. They spoke over grilled fish and arugula salad, under the warm tones of jazz and legacy. "You built this," Darius said, his voice low, "and I've scaled it, but sometimes I wonder if I've ever really touched the ground." Howard looked at him, eyes deep but kind. "You've touched many things, son, but not pain, not invisibility, not like that." Darius leaned back, letting the words land. "So what? You want me to walk a mile in their shoes?" "I want you," Howard said gently, "to disappear, just for a few days. No driver, no card, no identity. Strip it all down. See how the world looks when you have nothing to offer but a look in your eye." And so it began. No public announcement, no press stunt. Darius would go undercover, completely. A small team at Unity would know for safety, but to the world, he would become just another man on the street. 3 days later, his polished look was gone. His usual tailored suit was replaced with faded cargo pants, a puffy jacket frayed at the edges, and worn-out sneakers with uneven laces. His beard, usually trimmed, was let grow and subtly roughened with dark makeup dust. His skin was tinted to appear sun-worn, hair flattened, nails intentionally dulled, a fake hospital bracelet on one wrist. No wallet, no ID, just a backpack with a crumpled blanket, a half-empty water bottle, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He practiced walking slower, shoulders slightly hunched, a look that invited no conversation. The mirror didn't reflect power anymore. It reflected fragility, and oddly, fear. On his first morning, Darius boarded the early 7 a.m. bus from Rainier Valley to the Central District. No one met his eyes. When he reached downtown, he picked a spot near 5th and Pine, one of the busiest intersections in Seattle. He sat, quiet. He held a paper cup and waited. The first man to pass glanced once, then pulled his phone closer to his chest. The second woman crossed the street entirely. The teenager looked at him, then at his friend, and laughed. By noon, the coffee in his cup had cooled. His knees ached from the pavement. His pride was already unraveling. He hadn't said a word, but the world had spoken volumes. By the second day, the smell clung to him, not of filth, not yet, but of being unwashed, of sleeping upright, of pavement and exhaust and yesterday's coffee. Darius hadn't even realized how quickly it would happen. He hadn't done anything different. He hadn't rolled in the dirt. But something in the way people looked at him made the scent cling harder, as if judgment had a smell of its own. And now it was woven into his jacket. He had chosen a different corner this time. Union Street, near the entrance of a parking garage, a place where briefcases clicked by and coffee orders were barked into Bluetooth headsets. He held the same paper cup, but this time he added a sign, "Just trying to get home." It felt vague enough to invite empathy without inviting questions. But questions weren't coming. The most consistent reaction he received wasn't cruelty. It was the refusal to acknowledge he existed. Eyes would slide past him like water around a stone. He'd become part of the backdrop, as silent and ignored as the chipped sidewalk beneath him. The invisibility wasn't just psychological, it was deeply physical. At noon, he stood up to stretch his legs. That's when it happened. A security guard from the building across the street strode over. Walkie-talkie clipped high, mirrored sunglasses reflecting every ounce of Darius's reduced stature. "You can't sit here. Private property." Darius kept his tone soft. "I'm not hurting anyone. Just resting." The guard didn't blink. "Doesn't matter. Move along." He did, without argument. But a part of him wanted to say, "I've donated more to the city than your building's entire tax record." Instead, he nodded and shuffled off. That afternoon, he walked through Westlake Park, past benches half filled with lives and waiting. A woman bundled in a tan coat offered him a half-eaten granola bar. "You look new," she said without malice. He smiled faintly, took it and said nothing. For the first time, someone had looked at him, truly looked, and seen more than a shadow. But he couldn't return the gesture with truth. Not yet. By evening, the air turned sharper, biting through the seams in his jacket. He wandered toward the edge of Pioneer Square, where shelters began to dot the map like faint safe zones. He didn't check in. Not yet. He needed to feel the full weight of absence first. He found a spot behind a row of dumpsters near a loading dock. It smelled of grease and beer and wet cardboard. He folded his jacket beneath him and leaned against the brick wall, staring at the cracks between stars. Cars passed. Sirens blipped. A bottle broke nearby. Somewhere, someone was laughing. Too loud. Too free. Darius closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. His back ached. His stomach gnawed. Every sound felt like a question. Every silence an answer. He wasn't just seeing what it meant to have nothing. He was beginning to feel it in his bones. By the morning of day 3, his gait had changed, not because he intended it, but because the body learns how to survive discomfort. His shoulders naturally curled inward now. He avoided mirrors, reflections, even windows. Something about seeing himself like this, not in disguise but in absorption, unnerved him. At a bus stop, he sat beside a young woman eating a breakfast burrito. She offered him a napkin. No words, just a gesture. He nodded, grateful. A few minutes later, when she got up, she left the rest of the burrito on the bench beside him, still half-wrapped. A small act, but it filled him more than food. It filled him with reminder. Kindness existed, quietly. Still, for every kindness, there were 4 indifferences, and 1 humiliation. That afternoon, as he approached a gas station hoping to use the restroom, the attendant didn't let him inside. "No public bathrooms," the man said. Darius glanced at the woman who had just walked out moments earlier, holding her toddler's hand. "She just came out," Darius said quietly. The man leaned over the counter, voice tight. "She ain't you." Darius stared for a second longer, then stepped back into the sunlight. It was the kind of moment that, in his old life, would have earned a tweet, a press statement, a lawsuit. But now, it was dust, something to blow off and move forward. No one would fight for a nameless face on the edge of town. That night, he finally gave in and went to a shelter. He used a fake name, David T. No one asked. No one cared. He was given a cot, a scratchy blanket, and a cup of lukewarm stew. A man 2 bunks down asked. First time. Darius nodded. The man didn't press. They sat in silence as others snored, shifted, muttered. A woman in the corner rocked gently, clutching a bag of socks like a baby. Someone coughed into a pillow. And still, despite the discomfort, it felt less lonely. He realized then this world had its own rhythm, its own hierarchy, its own dignity. Not the polished, investor-approved kind, but a raw, unfiltered dignity that no one outside would ever understand, unless they stepped into it, unless they disappeared first. On the 4th day, something shifted, not in the world, but in him. Darius had begun to anticipate rejection before it came, the way someone's eyes twitched just before they turned away, the subtle tightening of a jaw, the flicker of discomfort when a stranger realized he was still standing there. He had memorized those micro-expressions, not because he wanted to, but because his dignity had started negotiating its own survival. Like a dancer adjusting to new music, he began to move before the beat of dismissal even landed. He stood outside a bakery that morning, the scent of cinnamon rolls wrapping around his hunger like a cruel joke. He didn't beg, just stood, still, waiting. After 20 minutes, a man in a business coat brushed past him, muttering, "Get a job." With all the bite of a slap, another woman pulled her child closer, whispering something in his ear while her eyes never left Darius's face. The child looked back at him as they passed, curious, not afraid. But his mother's hand pulled him forward like gravity. By late morning, Darius moved a few blocks to a shaded corner near a flower shop. A middle-aged woman exited with a bouquet in hand. She spotted him, paused for a beat, then stepped to the side, rummaging through her purse. For a moment, hope stirred, but she pulled out a wrapped sandwich, walked toward him, and dropped it not in his hands, but at his feet, then walked off without a word. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. The act, well-meaning or not, felt less like kindness and more like a feed-the-pigeon ritual. He didn't touch the sandwich. Instead, he picked it up gently, walked across the street, and handed it to a man sleeping in a doorway. The man opened one eye, then the other, and smiled. "Thanks, brother." Darius nodded. "You hungry?" "Always." The man chuckled. But not just for food. Those words echoed in Darius's mind for the next hour. By midday, he sat beneath a broken bus stop, knees pulled to his chest, face angled toward the ground. A teenager in a red hoodie sat beside him without warning. No hello, just sat. After a few minutes, the boy said, "I see you here yesterday." Darius looked up, surprised. "You talked to anyone?" The boy asked. "Not really," Darius replied, voice dry from hours of silence. The kid nodded. "Me neither." They sat in quiet companionship for a while. Then the boy stood up, reached into his backpack, and pulled out a cold bottle of water. "Here," he said. "I stole it, but you needed more." Darius hesitated. "You didn't have to." "I know." The kid cut in. "That's why I did." And then he left. It was the smallest flicker of defiance against a world that didn't see them, and yet it meant more than any $1 million pledge Darius had ever signed. Later that afternoon, a woman wearing a long beige coat approached his spot. She didn't offer food or money. Instead, she bent down and said softly, "Would you like to talk?" Her tone wasn't condescending. It wasn't pitying. It was curious, real. Darius nodded. She sat beside him, careful not to touch. "My name's Maribel," she said. "I used to be where you are. I get it." He studied her face, lines of fatigue, eyes that had seen too much. She shared her story. Not all of it, just enough. Lost her husband, fell into depression, evicted, lived out of a car for 6 months. People stopped looking at me like I was a person. She said, "It made me question whether I was." Darius swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said. "I just wanted you to know. This doesn't have to be forever." She stood, offered her hand. "You're still seen, maybe not by everyone, but by some." He took her hand, barely able to nod. By sunset, Darius had moved to a quieter part of the neighborhood. exhausted. As he sat down on a bench, two boys on scooters zipped past, one of them yelling, "You gross. He smells." They laughed. Darius closed his eyes. He'd begun to notice how pain often came not in punches but in petals, soft, repetitive degradations that fell slowly but buried you over time. As night fell, he walked along the edge of a shopping plaza and heard a familiar sound. The clink of coins. A man with thick glasses and a camo jacket sat nearby with a ukulele, playing old blues songs. Between tunes, he called out, "Spare change?" Even a smile. Darius approached slowly. The man stopped strumming. "You knew." Darius nodded. "You got a name?" He hesitated. "David." "Welcome to the audience, David." The man grinned, then strummed again. "You don't gotta pay, but if you hum along, I'll consider that currency." So Darius sat and listened, and after the third song he hummed. No one clapped, no coins dropped, but for the first time in days, Darius felt something return. A pulse of connection, however faint. When he finally stood to leave, the man looked up. "Hey, David." "Yeah, don't let them convince you that you're invisible. You're just in a different chapter, not the ending." Darius nodded. "Same to you." That night, he didn't sleep behind a dumpster. He found a narrow alley behind a bookstore where someone had left an old office chair. It was uncomfortable. The air still bit. But somehow, the day had stitched together enough moments to keep him from unraveling. Kindness didn't always come in the ways he expected. It didn't look like charity galas or photo ops. It didn't dress itself in applause. Sometimes it came in half a sandwich, in a stolen water bottle, in a song hummed off-key. But it came, and that alone was a reason to stay the course. On the morning of the sixth day, the air felt heavier, not because of the weather. Seattle's clouds remained their usual pale gray, but because Darius knew this would be his final day on the street. Tonight, he would return home. A warm shower, fresh clothes, the sound of his own name spoken with reverence again. But before that, there were things left unfinished. He walked past the bakery again, the same one where the businessman had muttered, "Get a job." As he shoved past, the memory was crisp, still raw. As Darius lingered outside, he noticed the same man exiting, pastry bag in hand, phone pressed to his ear. Their eyes met for a split second. This time, Darius didn't look away. The man paused mid-sentence, frowning. Then recognition flickered, not of Darius's true identity, but of association. "It's you." He muttered, voice half surprised, half annoyed. "Still here." Darius straightened. "I remember you," he said quietly. The man scoffed. "Figures. Guys like you never move on, always waiting for handouts." Darius held his gaze. "And people like you never imagine they're wrong." Before the man could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside the curb. The back door opened, and a sharply dressed woman stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Templeton," she called. The man blinked. "What did she just call you?" Darius turned to face her. "Just on time, Marcy." The woman approached with a nod, ignoring the businessman entirely. "Your press team is ready. You can change in the car. We've also got the footage compiled." The businessman looked between them, confused, his jaw tightening. Darius turned back to him. "I'm not homeless. Not really. I was just invisible for a week. You helped prove why." He walked toward the SUV, pausing just before entering. "Next time you see someone with nothing, ask yourself if it costs you anything to be kind." He didn't wait for a response. Inside the vehicle, a warm towel and clean change of clothes waited. As he scrubbed his hands with cleansing wipes, he watched the city blur past the tinted window. It looked different now. Not shinier, not cleaner, but somehow louder. He could see who people noticed, and who they didn't. After changing, Darius asked Marcy to take him to one more location, Pioneer Square. There, outside the shelter, he saw her, Maribel, sitting on a bench, her beige coat wrapped around her like armor. She didn't recognize him at first, not until he approached, smiling softly. "Maribel," he said. She glanced up and froze. "It's me," he said. "Darius." From the corner. Her eyes widened. What? He sat beside her. I wasn't who I said I was. I'm not homeless. I run Unity Market. She stared, mouth slightly open. I did this, he continued, because I needed to understand. I needed to feel it. Maribel searched his face. Why are you telling me now? Because you were kind when no one else was. Not out of pity, but out of understanding. I won't forget that. He reached into his coat and pulled out a card. There's a job waiting for you at Unity Community Outreach Team. Full-time, benefits, and housing assistance through our new pilot program. She took the card slowly, her hand trembling. You're serious? As serious as this coat is expensive. He smiled. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Later that afternoon, he found the teenager in the red hoodie again, skating circles near the park bench. Darius walked over, dressed sharp but casual. No entourage this time. The boy stopped. Hey, I know you. Darius smiled. You gave me water. Said I needed it more. You were pretending. No, Darius said. I was learning. He reached into his jacket and handed him a small envelope. Inside, a prepaid card and a contact for Unity's youth mentorship program. If you ever want a job or help getting into school, we'll back you. The boy looked down, then back up. I didn't do it for this. I know, Darius said. That's why it matters. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the sidewalks he'd once wandered as a ghost, Darius walked alone down Fifth Avenue one last time in silence. He passed a man asleep under a bus stop. People kept walking. No one looked. He slowed, then stopped, bent down, and left a fresh sandwich and a note folded on top. You are not invisible. The studio lights weren't blinding. They were soft, diffused through white panels, angled just enough to highlight Darius's face without erasing the lines that had deepened over the past week. He sat alone on the stool, no script in hand, no teleprompter, just a glass of water beside him, untouched. A single camera blinked red, and someone behind it signaled they were rolling. He didn't start right away. He breathed in slow, collected his thoughts not as a CEO, not as a brand, but as a man who had just lived as someone else. Then he began. I've spent 6 days living as someone invisible. His voice didn't tremble, but it carried the weight of memory. 6 days without a name, without a home, without identity. I was hungry, ignored, shoved, and pitted. I was seen as a threat. I was seen as a stain. But most of the time, I wasn't seen at all. He let the silence linger, just long enough for it to echo. I did this because I needed to understand. I've run a company built on the idea of serving the underserved. We say things like community first, and we care, and I believed that. I still do, but what I didn't understand, what I couldn't have understood, was what it feels like to be truly unseen. His hands folded slowly in his lap. There's a difference between helping and connecting, between giving and witnessing. $1 in a cup is helpful, yes, but a look in the eye, question asked, a moment of dignity given freely, that stays. He leaned slightly forward. I remember every person who ignored me. I remember the ones who crossed the street to avoid my presence. But more than that, I remember the teenager who gave me his water, the woman who shared her story, the musician who said, "You're not at the end, just a different chapter." His voice softened. We talk about homelessness like it's a disease, like it's contagious, like those who live without shelter have somehow failed at life. But I met former teachers, veterans, parents, kids, people who had lives and dreams and still do. What they've lost isn't just housing, it's the right to be acknowledged. He paused, then added, and here's the hardest part one had to accept. I was part of that problem. His eyes dropped for a second before rising again. I gave, I donated, I created programs, but I never really looked. Not until I sat on that pavement. Not until I felt the ache in my back from sleeping upright. Not until I flinched at a passing siren or stood outside a bakery wondering if someone would treat me like I mattered. He let those words breathe. Empathy isn't just a feeling. It's a decision, practice. It's choosing every day to see people not as statistics, not as burdens, but as stories still being written. Darius unfolded a small piece of paper from his jacket. It wasn't a script. It was the note he had left on the sandwich at the end of his final day. "You are not invisible. I wrote this for someone else," he said, but I realized it was something I needed to hear too. He looked directly into the lens now. The message wasn't to his board or his employees. It was to the people watching on couches, at desks, in traffic, in waiting rooms. If you're watching this, I'm not asking you to give everything. I'm asking you to notice, to look up, to speak when your instinct is to walk past, to remind someone that they matter. Even if it's just for a moment. A flicker of emotion danced across his face. Subtle, but sincere, because sometimes the smallest gesture can be the reason someone doesn't give up. The camera held steady. I went undercover to learn something about homelessness, but what I found was something about all of us, about what we choose to see, about what we ignore, about what it means to be human. He placed the paper gently on the stool beside him. "I'm back now, back to my name, my title, my comfort, but I carry every moment of that week with me, and I always will." He stood slowly, no rush in his movements. "We're expanding our programs, not just food, but housing access, job training, mental health support, and not from the top down but side by side, with people who've lived it, who understand it, who still carry it." He glanced once more at the camera. "And if the story moved you, don't just share it. Live it." The red light faded. The camera stopped. But Darius didn't move for a long while. He just stood there, breathing in the weight of everything he now knew, and everything he was still learning to carry.